August 15th, 2021. Kabul. 1910 local. The city was a husk, the power cut off from its very heart, and inside the US Embassy, the diesel coaches sat in a line, amber lights flashing in unison, as the order was given, all elements, on me, primary route to HKIA, no halts unless blocked, go. The gate slid open, and the armoured SUVs in front, followed by a clutch of buses filled with diplomats and aid workers and a few last-minute families, rolled past blast walls where murals had faded, shops with shuttered windows, pharmacies with a string of half-lit bulbs along their awnings. As they moved, everyone knew where they were headed by now. To a single word, airport, and at each intersection, the lead turret swept the alleys, slow and steady, while radios spat short bursts, call signs and checkpoints, and on the sidewalks, clusters of people moved the same way the convoy did, as if drawn along by some force of gravity toward HKYA. The second coach, the one in which a consular officer sat with her arms around a laptop sleeve, tallying what she'd packed, passport, badge, charger, one change of clothes, was also where the Afghan interpreter sat across the aisle, staring at his phone, where his wife's message remained pinned to the top of the screen. Are they letting families through? He typed a message, deleted it, typed another, and deleted that one too, before pocketing his phone and standing up as the bus bounced over a speed hump. Because half a click out, the convoy slowed to a halt and headlights illuminated a living wall. Hundreds of people at the fence, hundreds more packed in behind them, all of them lugging bags and ledgers and babies, while some held up documents and others raised nothing but open hands. The escort MRAP crept along the service road, and the Marine at the gate waved them through a narrow opening, closing the gate behind each vehicle as the sounds of Kabul gave way to the sounds of an airfield. HKIA was a machine in surge, with C-17 taxied like ships, their engines blowing hot chemical wind across the apron, and loadmasters in reflective belts chopped tight gestures, funneling people toward a yawning ramp, while north, wheels screamed and a giant lifted, and south, another grey fuselage took its slot. Every 15 or 30 minutes, another exhale into the dark, and near a hangar, cots lined taped off lanes, where a boy, face down, shoes on, a strip of masking tape with a surname written on the inside of his forearm, lay still, and a medic slipped a water bottle into the hand of a woman she didn't know was shaking. A British non-commissioned officer and an American airman exchanged hand signals over a pallet of MRES and a line that was growing longer, a line that didn't care what the food was called as long as it was food, and word spread, voiceless, that the runway had been overrun just hours before, with people sprinting beside taxiing jets, people climbing the gear doors, and people slipping, falling, vanishing, and the images were everywhere, and inside they were translated into orders. Secure the perimeter, lock down the access points, control the flow or lose the field, and a new language spread in just hours. Biometrics, manifest build, lily pad, safe lane, Abbey Gate. At the front of a truck hood, the airfield security captain briefed the convoy lead with the aid of a laminated diagram pinned down by 2 rifle mags, explaining that crowd pressure here, here, here. We are moving the entry point to the canal side tonight. It is going to be ugly. ISIS K. Chatter is up. We cannot hard close or we'll strand thousands. We cannot stay wide open or we'll invite a catastrophe. We thread it. And the convoy lead nodded and gazed out at the buses, while inside, people slept upright, heads tilted against windows that vibrated with each takeoff. And after midnight, the temperature dropped and breath ghosted in the ramp lights, and the scent was kerosene, rubber, sweat. As a C-17 lowered its ramp, and a wave surged, then paused at a loadmaster's slap on aluminum, with the order to, one by one, keep moving. And chalk marks showed where to sit, tighter, knees to duffels, shoulders to strangers, and a soft prayer in Dari was spoken, while the child was shushed with a pack of crackers. On the opposite side of the tarmac, a Marine corporal and an army specialist stood atop a Jersey barrier, looking east to the gate that would be remembered, and light glinted off a foul canal. And beyond the canal, the city was a glowing rash, too quiet and too loud all at once. and the corporal spoke up. You ever think the end of a war would look like this? And the specialist didn't turn from the fence, responding, No, but I think this is what it was always going to look like, because by dawn, the system had a pulse, with flights in, flights out, and manifests printing out faster than the paper could stack. And the convoy commander wrote the next times, the next times, in grease pencil on his windshield, and underlined one word. Last, although none of them knew when that would be, only that every road led to it, and outside the wire, Kabul pressed its face to the fence, while inside, the jets kept lifting off, drawing white lines in the sky that pretended nothing was happening below. August 26th, 2021, 1712, Abbey Gate was a surf of voices, crashing and receding against concrete and concertina, where the Marines stood shin-deep in the brown canal, their sleeves soaked, pulling people forward by the wrists to the slit where ID became permission, and permission became escape, because the heat was hammering the tin and the Hesco. A sergeant was barking, one line. His voice reduced to a drumbeat, while beyond the wire, families were holding papers aloft, including SIV packets, letters, and printouts from copy shops that had shut down the day Kabul fell, and an interpreter was shoving a plastic sleeve through the coils. A lance corporal skimmed it, nodded, and said, You, your wife, your kids, stay tight, as the gate crew beat out a rhythm of the impossible. Check, wave, make a gap, fill it, seal it before the crowd knew, although rumours rippled like wind in wheat, saying they're closing. No more flights, only British now. Overwatch called from the tower, blue shirt, black backpack, seesawing left, and the laser died at the fence, while the threat board on a radio case said, SVEST possible, VBIED possible, imminent, the Sharpie bleeding under the sweat. A Marine captain strode the trench, saying, Hydrate, rotate, eyes up, as the net braided warnings with logistics, including a C-17 inbound, and the crowd swelling east because the air was thick with kerosene and dust and the sweet, sour smell of warm water. A grapnel tossed over the bank, and an Afghan mother lifted her infant up as if to a lifeguard, while the baby didn't cry, and late in the afternoon, light went hard and short. Therefore, pararescue medics had turned a sliver of shade into a bay, administering saline through a comms antenna and cuffs on wrists marked in ink, treating fevers, dehydration, and razor wire gashes. Beyond the canal, the push never stops. However, hands had already begun to grope for anything to grasp, including wire, wood, and the shoulders of strangers, while a drone had whispered low overhead, and an aircraft somewhere had rotated and its wheels thudded. Consequently, in the tower, a voice said, Reporting indicates ISIS-K cell in vicinity. Then static took the rest. The captain tapped the threat board, saying, We're not closing, not yet. And at 1750, the place took a breath, as brass light filled the area. Meanwhile, a corporal pointed at a young man arrested too long in the motion, eyes wide and steady. He opened his mouth to shout and saw only hands rising, not in threat but in surrender. However, the blast folded the day in half, sound into force, into light, into dust, and the canal flashed white, while wire jumped and bodies dropped, therefore a ringing inside teeth and bone. Then the roar, Doc, Doc, echoed as training outran thought, and tourniquets bloomed black and blue, while hands found junctions and pressed bone white. A Marine with a sleeve shredded to the shoulder crawled to a buddy and grinned a humorless grimace that said, We're here. Keep moving. Meanwhile, a British medic vaulted the barrier into the red water, and someone yelled, Clear a lane. And even the crowd parted. Consequently, Overwatch called contacts, then called them off, saying no second shooter seen. The scene unwound in frames, including a ripped pack, a lone shoe, and a laminated packet bleeding ink into the canal, while a lance corporal jammed a dressing into his thigh, and an Afghan teacher clamped his wrist with the practiced politeness of a diplomat, saying, Almost there, which the Marine said. And the teacher's eyes showed he knew they didn't mean the hospital or the ramp, but a place neither of them could name. Radio voices wove a braid of grief and procedure, including a KIA count climbing, CATA priority, and a route to roll 2 clear, as a C-17 sat on hot brakes, while clerks wiped faces, kept typing names into columns that shook with generator coughs, and a senior non-commissioned officer held a phone a second too long, then pocketed it like a tool, not a tether. By full dark, Abbey Gate was both wound and vow. Therefore, the Marines tightened the line, the paratroopers reset the serpentine, and the interpreters climbed the barrier and shredded their voices, building a flow from a place erased, because after the worst thing, people moved differently, careful, deliberate, eyes wider, sentences shorter. The gate did not close, however, it couldn't. So they bled, worked, and opened the corridor again. Meanwhile, morning would turn numbers into briefings, and names into gold stars and mantle photos. But in the hours after, only 3 counts mattered: tourniquets, pulse intervals, and the distance from trench to ramp. Consequently, the people kept coming, hands kept lifting, and the wire somehow held. August 17 to 29, 2021, and HKIA was the setting for this event. The airport pulsed, one C-17 landed, was loaded, departed in 15 to 20 minutes, and in between the ramp was pure ballet. Airlift was a verb: marshal, chalk, manifest, load, lock, launch, and on the north ramp, a loadmaster drew with pencil on a laminated page, balancing pallets of baggage, generator, water, MRES, because this was a critical part of the process. Hand up, column began to advance, and knees to bags, shoulders touching, thus creating a sense of unity and purpose. He said it until he had no other sentence, so he stopped talking and continued working. Behind, the flow cell glowed. Laptops, a map with pins to Al Udeid, Doha, Kuwait, Ramstein, Rota, Bahrain, and this was the nerve center of the operation. Lieutenant Colonel in helmet shifted boxes. 2 stacked, 1 turned east. Qatar, solid 6 hours, advance on Kuwait, Ramstein conditions marginal post 0300, and one thing mattered: the bridge must stay open, therefore every effort was made to keep it that way. Taxiway A, C-17 ran with ramp halfway down, venting, and in the hold, green NVG glow, thus creating an otherworldly atmosphere. Girl counting ribs started again when belt halted her, and opposite, man clutching folder with suggestions and pictures, evidence there was no return, so they were both focused on their tasks. Runway never slept, and sodium lights turned night into an old battlefield with new tactics, because the situation was constantly evolving. Controllers traded seconds like currency, and seconds bought sorties, so every moment counted. Sorties, lives, and at the eastern gate, the crowd surged on rumour and promise, thus creating a sense of excitement and anticipation. Soldiers and special tactics sketched safe lanes with chem lights, rope, a shouted name, a clipboard, a prayer, because this was a matter of life and death. On a whiteboard, packs out climbed, evidence the bridge held, and outside the fence, deconfliction in kindergarten terms. Pointed, head shake, circle in dust, 5 fingers for 5 minutes. So communication was key. Clear lane 10 minutes and we take another 1,000. And in the air, tears. At 30,000 feet, tankers fed forever. Below, J-stars sketched friendly codes stacked like Tetris, thus creating a complex and dynamic system. One geometry mistake and aluminium hit aluminium. It didn't, because the pilots were skilled and careful, so they avoided any accidents. From Doha, land, unload, return at dawn, and a loadmaster sent his wife a picture of the pallet next to a pink shoe. We are okay, and it's a lot, so I will talk to you when it's calm. But calm never came. Speed left artifacts: a rusty pram, an empty violin case, abandoned duffels, and a chaplain handed out water in silence, thus providing comfort to those in need. An engineer recorded a normal PSI, normalcy in a place without measurement, and numbers turned into legend: 600 on a flight, 10,000 a day, more than 100,000 in 2 weeks. So the scale of the operation was immense. The math on the ramp was easy. Capacity times cycles equals bridge length, and bridge length equals distance to safety. Therefore, the calculations were crucial. The wind picked up and the bridge began to sway, and the rumours closed the gates. The routes were blocked, The flow settled into new patterns, like water, so the situation was constantly changing. In the cargo, human geometry developed sharp edges, children to the hull, where vibration is most severe, teenagers in the middle, elders to the ramp, where the air is softer because the goal was to minimize discomfort. The crews learned the phrase that worked in every language: you are on plane, and not will be, so they focused on the present moment. Teams on shift developed rituals as time helped: a timer clipped to molle, a marker taped to glove, 3 songs on repeat in hangar, and at 10 minutes, 10 fingers fluttered. At 3 taps on loader. At wheels down, 1 go. So they created their own routines. Pain and grace lived together. A boy lost his blue backpack and left it behind, and a woman passed out crackers until a third of the cabin chewed quietly. A small sharing in a war machine, thus creating a sense of community. The bridge grew backward too. Rapid vetting, phones on biometrics, a note, gather family, row 6 aft left, and the database held more than anyone expected, so it was a complex and efficient system. A coastie peed, semper paratus, and a marine gunner grinned, both, so they shared a moment of humour. On 26, Abbeygate took the bridge, and the airlift stuttered, but did not stall. Therefore, the operation continued. The last days were louder, voices more parched on radio, less joking, footsteps warmer, and each arrival might be final, each departure likewise, so the tension was palpable. The word last perched on all lips, curse and promise, and 29th August, storms in Gulf, the impossible schedule became real, thus creating a sense of urgency. In Ops, Lieutenant Colonel collected his final arrows, and a photographer took a photo of the board, because this was a historic moment. The ground boss assembled the teams, and "We're almost there," he said. "Don't run the last kilometre, and don't trip, so keep your heads up, and no cutting corners, and finish strong," thus providing motivation and encouragement. At the hammerhead, a C-17 sucked air once, and motors whirred, an aircraft turned, and span supported another journey, thus creating a sense of completion and fulfillment. August 31st to September 15th, 2021, was a period of time when Ramstein, Doha, Kuwait, and Dulles were connected by a bridge that didn't end at the runway, but rather ended under fluorescent lights. At Ramstein, a gym became a small city by noon, with rows of cots, hourly chimes, and whiteboards displaying messages such as "Family Reunify, Row G, Bay 12," while a volunteer scanned wristbands and answered the same question with practiced patience, saying, "Yes, you're on the list. Yes, your husband too, and yes, there will be a flight." Outside, buses idled, while a medic walked with open hands, using the universal gesture of "give me the baby," because the situation required immediate action. In Doha, the heat was intense, even in the shade, where evacuees lined up at folding tables, while CBP officers checked documents under portable fans, because the temperature was unbearable. A soldier told an interpreter with a suitcase bound by tape, "Your English is how we survived. We're the ones who should apologize," thus acknowledging the interpreter's crucial role in their survival. On a TV, a loop of the last jet departing Kabul repeated, then cut to maps and clean studio faces far from JP-8 and dust, because the reality on the ground was different from what was being reported. Numbers remained numbers: 124,000 evacuated, 6,000 Americans, tens of thousands of allies. But the math was different on the ground, where a State Department officer stared at a spreadsheet and whispered, "Find me one more seat," while a US CIS adjudicator stamped a form, and the applicant cried not for safety, but for recognition, because after 20 years in the shadows, he had finally been acknowledged. At Dulles, jetways delivered families into cavernous halls where volunteers held signs in Dari, Pashto, and English because communication was key, and a boy pushed his grandmother in a stroller that carried a dusty stuffed bear, while the TSA agent who said no to everyone all day was handing out donated shoes to anyone who wanted them, saying, "We're the yes table today," thus spreading hope and kindness. Outside, a Marine in civvies hugged a man in a pressed shalwar kameez until they both lost their breath, then laughed at the awkwardness of being alive, because they had finally found each other, and 2 weeks ago they'd yelled at each other over the wire, but now they could stand and talk at a human distance. Therefore, they were grateful for this new beginning. Grief moved on its own clock, and in a dimly lit chapel, a chaplain lit 31 candles, 13 for Abbey Gate and 18 for the Afghans whose names were still being put together because they needed to be remembered. In a conference room, a casualty officer practiced the hardest simple line, "I'm here to help," while in the mess hall, the table ate in silence until someone told a story about a kid who'd been at Gate 3 who wanted to be a Marine because the men in the canal were the only ones who didn't freak out when no one else was calm, and the spoons clinked against the metal trays, and the table collectively exhaled because they had finally found some sense of peace. And then, in the United States, on bases from Fort McCoy to Fort Bliss to JBMDL, tent cities sprouted with pallets of diapers and pallets of socks because the evacuees needed basic necessities, and a reservist who was a grocer suddenly discovered he had precisely the skill set needed to feed 10,000 people who all take their tea differently. Thus, he was able to make a significant contribution. In intake, a nurse painted a tiny purple dinosaur on the bandage covering a little girl's knee and told her mother, in a firm but kind voice, "This will scar, she will tell this story, it will not define her," because the nurse wanted to reassure the mother that her daughter would be okay. And back in Kabul, floodlights flickered as the new keepers learned keys and gates and schedules, and that aircraft obeyed checklists, not wishes, because they needed to understand the new reality. And in Sharinor, a man scrolled past names he could no longer call, but he deleted none, because he still held on to the memories. And near Karga Road, a woman sealed the diplomas in the wall with plaster and a prayer, because she wanted to preserve the past. And one war had ended, but another, quieter fear had begun. Therefore, the situation was still uncertain. Inside the Pentagon, timelines grew from minutes and decisions, and who knew when, with arrows on butcher paper, because big problems require simple tools, and after-action teams asked the questions that hurt, while an O5 drew Abbey Gate on a whiteboard and said, "We did the thing we came to do," on the worst day to do it, not as an excuse, but as a soldier's way to avoid drowning in adjectives, because they needed to focus on the facts. Nearby, a civilian tried to graph moral injury and discovered some truths don't belong on slides because they were too complex, and veterans found each other in group texts and midnight calls because they needed support. A former platoon leader ran a shared spreadsheet of names for 2 sleepless weeks, smuggling hope through a moving border of favors, and when he finally slept, he dreamed of gates that kept opening, because he still held on to the hope of rescue, and a former MEDEVAC pilot taped a note to the office coffee pot, saying, "If you served, loved someone who served, or have feelings without words, come talk, or don't, I'm here," because he wanted to offer support, and the pot emptied twice before lunch, while news cycles turned, and speeches were made, and Gold Star families stood at microphones, and in living rooms, an endless silence, saying, "The end of America's longest war," echoed like a mantra that threatened to obscure as much as illuminate, because the reality was more complex. For those who dragged people from a filthy canal into a corridor of light, the war didn't end, it migrated, and the convoy continued in the imagination. A straight line from a damaged gate to an inviting ramp, because they still held on to the memories, and in a decade, a boy who slept on the floor of a C-17 will point to his new home on a classroom map, and his teacher will pronounce it wrong once before getting it right, while in 2 decades, a former lance corporal will watch his daughter miss a goal and feel grateful for a day that was unremarkable, because he had finally found peace. In 5 decades, someone will fish a photograph from a shoebox with a green light, packed faces, and a ramp like an open mouth, and say, "That was us, the night the Empire left, and we didn't let the dark take everyone," because they would still remember the past. The bridge is gone, but the bridge remains, because both are true of human work, built from minutes and muscle and checklists and kindness, not heroics so much as stubbornness. And we carried what we could, and we left what we couldn't. Therefore, the space between those sentences is where endings refuse to be neat, because the reality is complex, and the memories still linger. Everywhere and nowhere, September to December 2021, the airlift's math spilled into civilian life, the way jet noise never fades, because in a church basement near Sacramento, folding tables became intake desks for housing, school, medical, and work. An Afghan father unfolded a paper softened by handling, revealing his A number and the names of his 4 children, which he tapped one by one as the volunteer nodded at each tap, signatures without ink. At Fort McCoy, leaves turned and tents learned wind, while afternoon English class was taught by a former lawyer, driver, soldier, and teacher, students all, where the instructor wrote to leave, left, left, underlining as if she were tracing a wound, and in the back of the room, a boy in a blue hoodie whispered the forms, trying them in sentences that began with airplanes and ended with bikes. Across US living rooms, TV panels argued, and people who still ached from lifting strangers out of a canal texted coordinates and case numbers. Consequently, spreadsheets bloomed, featuring color tabs for families, gate photos, and WhatsApp threads that ran to dawn. A Marine once taped a list inside a kitchen cabinet, a list of 10 he couldn't move then, and 10 he would move now, even if it meant selling his truck, which his spouse called the other grocery list, and stocked the pantry like a quartermaster, because logistics is love by another name. On Capitol Hill, hearings turned minutes into theatre, where questions were asked such as, "Would you do anything differently?" To which the answer was yes, and did we leave Americans? To which the response was, we left people we wanted to bring. However, the question of whether it was worth it remained, because the air thinned, and no sentence could carry 20 years without dropping pieces. Staffers took notes they'd never reread, and took calls from men who landed at Bagram at the start and felt this ending like a pulled stitch, while in Kabul, a classroom door stuck for good, and the teacher with diplomas hidden in a wall walked by with a practiced neutral face, because fresh paint on the fence and new routines on the runway were a stark contrast to the chaos that had ensued. A boy kicked a crushed bottle and told his cousin he'd be a pilot anyway. Meanwhile, dreams moved, but borders were slow. Therefore, one morning in Ramstein, a crew of a C-17 gathered for coffee without the usual ramp and load plan, and they sat in silence until one of them pulled out a photograph. The green-lit cargo bay, their faces turned away by accident, and they identified themselves by their hands, gloved, bare, holding water, or on a stranger's shoulder, saying we look tired, and we were, as they laughed that laugh that concedes but does not surrender. Manifests became school rosters, clinic schedules, and payrolls, as the secretary of a school in Houston added Dari and Pashto to a drop-down menu, and bus routes detoured around new apartments, while at a free clinic in Virginia. An Afghan nurse who arrived on day 3 took blood pressure, translated numbers into reassurance, saying, "You will be fine, less salt," and wrote her name in Roman letters and in Arabic, which the patient kept like a prescription for belonging. The names of the dead, however, took a different route, because at Camp Pendleton, a memorial wall accumulated Sharpie notes, patches, and a pair of dog tags, where bubbles formed under the laminated Abbey Gate roster, punctuation that couldn't escape. In Omaha, an Afghan family learned the word snow by walking into it, while the boy in the hoodie let flakes land on his tongue, and his father texted a photo to a number abroad, saying, "Soon," as 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then reappeared. Sometimes the reply was, "Inshallah," and sometimes a pin on a satellite map, because the military penned after-action reviews in the hope of wrangling chaos into columns. A major typed the line, "Speed saved lives, speed cost control," then deleted it, typed it again, then deleted it, and typed it once more, leaving it there, while a sergeant first class had built a training lane with HESCO, wire, and a kiddie pool for the canal, saying it's not the same, but it's the best we can do without the smell, as they ran the lane again and again, until muscle memory dulled fear. Although it was not a cure, it was a tool. The group chats continued, with Pineapple, Manifest, and Gate 3 family, as they kept threading rescues, such as an aunt in Mazar, a cousin in Doha, and a commando on the far side of a border, waiting for the next bridge, because the grammar held, green check for good news, blue heart for I'm here, plain emoji for hope. And sometimes the thread went metal quiet, then on as the ending taught a crooked lesson. Some convoys don't stop at the last checkpoint, they blur into diaspora. Paperwork, patience, Thanksgiving tables where the rice is perfect and the turkey a little dry, and both truths are funny. In a Phoenix library, the boy in the hoodie checked out astronomy and engines, with due dates stamped like small promises. We will see you again by then. While somewhere over an ocean, a C-17 slid through weather, its crew running checklists in a practiced hush that felt holy because it had carried paratroopers, pallets, and a knight that will sit inside them until someone who never wore boots asks the question that lets it out. And until then, the manifest lives on in kitchens, inboxes, and the memory of black marker, once on a child's wrist, long washed away, still felt under a parent's thumb. September 2021, and the years after, coordinates vary because the war's ledger didn't close with the last flight. It moved into kitchens, inboxes, and glove compartments, with names on sticky notes and manifests without planes. In Tampa, a major reread a final SIGACT like a letter from a vanished friend, which said NSTR, and he laughed once at the irony. Meanwhile, in a clinic beneath fluorescent lights, a receptionist practiced, "We're glad you're here," while an Afghan elder asked if his blood pressure could learn a new place, to which the nurse replied, "It can." Pushpins spread across a US map, including San Antonio, Sacramento, Sioux Falls, and Scranton, constituting constellations waiting for names, because at a VFW, a Marine tried to explain why Kabul felt lodged in his chest, and a Vietnam vet answered gently, "We didn't lose it all. Count who you got out." Although counting helped and didn't. Energy doesn't go away. It changes. Therefore, binders bulked up, and diagrams tidied Abbey Gate into lines with no smell. Moreover, on page 42, a note said, "Plan the last convoy on day 1," and the signatory underlined time twice. In Virginia, the boy in the blue hoodie had on a Letterman jacket now, and he tossed a baseball into the air, while his father watched the weather out of habit and pulled out his phone to see if his cousin, still in transit, had sent any new messages. However, none were received. Consequently, the inning flipped, and C-17S went back to pallets, paratroopers, dignitaries, and dogs, and on a ramp that was quiet, a loadmaster found a dead chem light wedged by a tie-down ring and listened to its silence. Additionally, WhatsApp threads remained live, with green checks and blue hearts and plain emojis, and photos of snow were sent to Kabul with messages like, "You will hate this, it is wonderful," and a GoFundMe for a grandmother's rent. Debts owed, debts paid, debts that will never be paid, are braided into a pocketable rope, and one day a museum will mount a green-lit photograph, a manifest, a pair of dusty shoes labelled The Last Convoy, and most people who see it will admit they were watching, although watching is not nothing, and that witness is a weight, while arguments about strategy and blame will continue, as they should. However, in the din of them, small rituals will endure, such as a rail tapped before takeoff, a missing Sharpie checked for by habit, and a child hearing an engine and teaching his friends to say plane in his first language. Thus, what will endure is a single line. We built a bridge out of minutes and metal, and for a while, it held. The rest is footnotes and ghosts, because the Empire didn't leave, so much as it ran out of verbs it could conjugate in the place, and the line became a loop, including Ramstein, Doha, Dulles, Dallas, with apartments that smelled of cardamom, laundromats that smelled of warm coins, and classrooms that debated snow days, while the convoy still runs, thinner and quieter. If you listened the night the last bird climbed out, you could hear 2 braided lists, those who made it aboard and those who did not, and the machine carried both, although the ledger will not balance, which is not failure, because the human condition is reflected in aluminum and JP8, in checklists and chaos, with hands passing a child forward, hands catching, steady.